A Shadow in Daylight. Chapter 1. Part 1, The Beginning. Africa 1989. Marcus stood beside his father, the weight of the rifle pulling at his young arms. The cold bit at his fingers, and he longed to shove his hands into his jacket pockets for warmth, but he resisted the urge. Giving the rifle back wasn't an option. He wanted to be ready, to prove himself. His father's presence loomed large, silent but expectant, and Marcus felt the responsibility settle over him like a heavy cloak. He glanced up at his dad, who nodded toward the horizon. Whatever came to the watering hole, Marcus wanted to make sure he'd be the one to take the shot. Marcus watched his dad intently, trying to mirror every movement with precision. His father kicked the loose sand beneath his boot, sending a swirl of dust into the air, where it danced briefly before being swept away into the tall, dry grass. "We need to move," his dad said quietly, his voice low but firm. "The wind's turned, they're gonna smell us." Marcus nodded, gripping the rifle tighter. He shifted his stance, ready to follow, the weight of his father's experience guiding him through the silence. The tension of the hunt crackled in the air as they prepared to slip through the wilderness unnoticed. His dad glanced at him quickly, his voice a soft whisper, "Keep your finger off the trigger and let's move." Marcus nodded, determined to follow every instruction perfectly. He shifted his grip on the rifle, making sure his ice-cold finger stayed far from the trigger. He could feel the weight of his dad's gaze, measuring his every move. Noticing the care Marcus took to avoid mistakes, his father gave a small, approving smile. It was brief, but it meant everything. "Okay, let's go," his dad said, the smile fading back into the seriousness of the moment as they started moving quietly through the grass. Marcus's dad loved the African bush. He knew almost every bird by their call, every tree by name. The wild seemed like a second home to him, a place where he moved with effortless confidence. Marcus, on the other hand, was buzzing with excitement. He could barely contain it, the thrill of finally being on a hunt almost too much to handle. He couldn't wait to say he had taken down something, to feel the pride in his father's eyes. But the challenge was greater than he expected. His heart pounded in his chest, and every breath felt like it might betray their presence. He knew he couldn't make a sound. "The impala are just on the other side of the watering hole," his dad whispered, voice low and steady, always calm. "Let's move over to that tree. You can get a good shot from there." Marcus nodded again, the weight of the rifle feeling heavier now. His dad motioned forward, and they moved silently through the grass, each step deliberate, with Marcus following his father's lead. As they reached the tree, Marcus's dad motioned for him to rest the rifle's stock over a thick, sturdy branch. It was just high enough for Marcus to reach without straining, offering a steady position for the shot. "This is as close as we can get," his dad whispered, eyes scanning the distance. "You ready, Marcus?" Marcus nodded, breathless but determined. He couldn't see any impala yet, but that didn't matter, he was ready. His heart thudded in his chest as he focused on the rifle, fingers steady, waiting for the moment his dad had been preparing him for. He had to trust the impala were there, just beyond his sight, and that his father knew exactly where they would be. Marcus carefully rested the rifle on the tree branches in front of him, his hands steady but his heart racing. He took a few deep breaths, trying to calm his nerves. He had trained for moments like this countless times, and while he could shoot well, better than most, this was different. This wasn't like hunting birds in the garden. The tension, the weight of anticipation, was overwhelming. Every tiny sound he made, even the rustle of his clothes, seemed deafening in the silence, amplified until it echoed like thunder in his ears. Even his own breathing seemed too loud. This was far tougher than he had ever imagined, but as the adrenaline surged through him, he realized it was also the most alive he had ever felt. "You see the big ram on the left?" Marcus's dad whispered, gesturing toward it. Marcus squinted, then raised the rifle, searching for the ram through the scope. "Yeah, I see it," he nodded quietly. "All right," his dad said softly. As soon as he turned sideways, aim just behind the shoulder, right where the colors blend together. "Remember, slow squeeze on the trigger, don't jerk it." Marcus steadied himself, the weight of his dad's calm voice guiding him. His finger hovered over the trigger as he focused, waiting for the perfect moment. Marcus kept his eye pressed to the scope, moving the crosshairs to the exact spot his dad had told him. The ram was still facing them, its large ears twitching like satellite dishes. Nose lifted to catch the scents in the air. Marcus was tense, his muscles starting to ache from holding still for so long. His legs burned, but he knew he couldn't move. Not now. He had to stay completely still. Time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the ram turned sideways, exposing its right side. Now, Marcus thought to himself, his finger tightening on the trigger. He could feel the anticipation coursing through him, his heart racing as he prepared to take the shot he'd been waiting for. But just as his finger began to squeeze the trigger, the bushes in front of them exploded with movement. In an instant the stillness was shattered. Marcus looked up from the scope, his heart sinking as he watched the chaos unfold. Animals scattered in every direction. Warthogs, impala, birds, all fleeing in a panic. Confused and a little sad, Marcus asked, "What's going on?" His small voice carried a mix of amazement and disappointment. He turned to his dad, expecting to be scolded for scaring the animals away. But instead, his dad had a wide smile on his face, catching Marcus completely off guard. "Look," his dad said, pointing just to the right of where the ram had stood. Marcus followed his dad's gesture and then he saw it, a big leopard, sleek and powerful, dragging one of the young impala. Marcus had never seen a leopard in the wild before. The sight filled him with awe, even as the sadness of missing his shot lingered. His dad, sensing his disappointment, knelt down beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, son. What you just saw, most people never experience in their whole lives. We were incredibly fortunate today. There will be more impala, more chances, but this was special." Marcus looked back at the leopard, realizing that his dad was right. It was a moment he would never forget. Part 2, Present Day. Julia had always been drawn to the outdoors, a passion that seemed at odds with her professional life as a criminal psychologist. Her auburn hair, with soft waves cascading down her shoulders, caught the light as she reached for another handhold on the cliff face. Her emerald green eyes, sharp and perceptive, scanned the rocks ahead with the same intensity she applied to reading people's emotions. There was something both ethereal and strong about her presence, like a warrior who had weathered countless battles, though hers were mostly within the mind. She often found solace in nature, where the complexities of human behavior faded into the simplicity of survival. It was during one of her regular rock climbing sessions at an indoor gym that she first met Marcus. He was hard to miss. Standing tall, with a muscular build that spoke of years of conditioning, Marcus was the kind of man who drew eyes without trying. His long sun-kissed blonde hair fell to his shoulders, his sharp features and piercing gaze giving off an intensity that seemed out of place in the peaceful climbing gym. A tattoo traced his skin, a symbol and patterns that hinted at a life lived in the shadows, each mark telling a silent story. There was something fierce in the way he moved, as though every step and grip were calculated, yet his demeanor was calm, almost detached. Though older than her by more than a decade, there was a calm confidence about him that Julia found reassuring. His chiseled face, with the scars and hardened expressions of someone who had seen combat, intrigued her, yet there was a warmth hidden in his eyes that told her he wasn't just a man of action but one of thought and reflection. Their connection began here, with climbing as their shared passion. They started climbing together more frequently, often taking trips into the mountains. Their conversations were light, easy, but Julia couldn't help noticing that Marcus never talked much about his past. He would mention bits and pieces about his life, but nothing too revealing. He seemed to live in the present, focusing on the next climb, the next trail. Julia, used to analyzing people, didn't push him. She respected his boundaries, though she remained curious. There was something about Marcus that she couldn't shake, a mystery she hadn't yet solved. Despite her profession, she had learned that patience was key in uncovering the truth behind people's facades, and Marcus wore his like armor. Marcus, now 39, preferred this peaceful life, away from the chaos of his past. He had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. But that was a life he had left behind, or at least tried to. Even with his powerful frame, his demeanor was laid back, and he rarely seemed to worry about much. He kept things light and carefree, and Julia enjoyed the sense of security he projected in their adventures together. Their connection deepened over time, though it remained unspoken that there was a part of Marcus's life he wasn't ready to share. She trusted him though. In their many trips together, he had always been a steady presence, someone she could count on. And that was enough for her, for now. Marcus's hands moved with precision as he gripped a crimp, an almost imperceptible ledge jutting from the rock face. His legs extended, his foot resting solidly on a small foothold, his movement smooth and effortless. He glanced down at Julia, just a few feet below, carefully positioning herself into a high step, her fingers searching for the next hold. "Need a hand with that mantle?" Marcus grinned, hanging casually by one hand from the overhang, his other arm outstretched. Julia rolled her eyes, reaching for the sloper above her. "I'm fine, show off. Besides, you'll burn out your grip if you keep pulling stunts like that." With a playful shake of her head, she clasped his hand. Marcus, with an almost ridiculous ease, pulled her up onto the ledge. Once beside him, she gave him a light shove, laughing. Careful, next time I'll dino past you, Julia quipped, her breath even despite the climb. Yeah sure, you'd totally nail that jump, Marcus teased, though his eyes showed nothing but pride. Reaching the summit, Marcus pulled himself up onto the rocky plateau, offering Julia his hand as she cleared the final ledge. They stood side by side, catching their breath, taking in the breathtaking view below. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the valley. Trees stretched for miles, their canopies a blanket of green, and in the distance, a waterfall cascaded gracefully into the shimmering river below. Julia let out a small, contented sigh, leaning into Marcus as they watched the sun dip lower. It's perfect up here. Marcus nodded, pulling her closer. Yeah, doesn't get much better than this. The light slowly faded, and the orange hues of the sky deepened. As the last traces of sunlight disappeared, they made their way down to their camp, where a small fire crackled warmly, casting soft shadows around them. Sitting beside the fire, Marcus stoked the flames with a stick, the occasional pop of embers rising into the night air. Julia sat across from him, her face illuminated by the firelight, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. We could do this every day, you know, she said softly, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. Find a little piece of land somewhere quiet, just the two of us. We could build something. Maybe a cabin or a house near the woods. Somewhere with space to breathe. Marcus smiled, his gaze steady on hers. A little farm maybe? With a garden, some chickens? His tone was teasing, but his eyes held a sincerity she recognized. Exactly. Julia grinned, her voice light but full of hope. A place where we can have a big garden, fresh air every morning. No noise except for the birds and the wind in the trees. We'd be happy, right? Just you and me, building a life away from everything. Marcus reached across the fire, taking her hand in his. I think we'd be more than happy, he said softly, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. I'd follow you anywhere, Jules. Julia's smile deepened, her eyes softening. Good, because I'd want you right there with me every step of the way. For a moment, the fire crackled between them and they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their words settling into the evening air. They didn't need to say more. Everything they felt was in the quiet that surrounded them. In the warmth of the fire, and in the way they held each other's gaze. The fire crackled softly, and Marcus watched Julia as she spoke, her words filled with hope and warmth. She painted a picture of a peaceful life, one far removed from the chaos and danger he had known for so long. It was a life he never thought he could have, one he hadn't even dared to dream about. As her voice trailed off, he found himself drifting into his thoughts, his gaze still fixed on her, but his mind wandering to the life he had left behind. The military, the missions, the weight of the things he'd seen and done, it was all still there, locked deep inside him, in a place he didn't want to go. Not now. Not ever, if he could help it. But since Julia had come into his life, things had started to shift. Even though he tried his best not to show it. Before her, everything felt so tangled, so heavy. He had been running from the past, from himself. But somehow, with her, things had become simple again. Clear. He didn't need the noise, the adrenaline, or the constant chaos anymore. He didn't want it. Julia had brought light back into his world, a kind of warmth he hadn't felt since before everything went wrong. He never talked about it, or the way he'd buried that pain deep down, hoping to forget it. And he wasn't ready to bring it up now. Not yet. But here, sitting with her under the stars, watching the fire flicker in her eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He just wanted things to stay this way. Simple. Uncomplicated. Safe. Julia looked over at him, her smile softening as she noticed the quiet thoughtfulness in his expression. What are you thinking about? She asked, her voice gentle. Marcus blinked, coming back to the moment. He smiled, shaking his head slightly. Just how good it feels to be here. With you. Her smile grew, and she leaned closer, her hand resting on his. It's where you're supposed to be. Marcus squeezed her hand, the warmth of the fire reflecting the warmth he felt inside. He didn't need to say anything more. She was right. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Part 3, The Unexpected Trail. One weekend, Julia and Marcus planned an ambitious hike in the nearby mountains. They had heard whispers of a beautiful trail rumored to lead through breathtaking scenery, a place where few had ventured. Excited by the idea of exploration, they packed their gear and set off early in the morning. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth as they navigated the winding trails. The vibrant colors of autumn surrounded them, with leaves crunching beneath their boots. As they walked deeper into the woods, they relished the familiar sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the soft crunch of their boots on the path. "This is what hiking is all about," Julia said, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. Marcus smiled, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. "You can't beat the feeling of being out here. Just us and the wilderness." They pressed on, enjoying the challenge of the rugged terrain. After a while, they came across a rocky outcrop, and at its base, they spotted the entrance to a cave. A weathered sign hung above the opening, warning, "Danger, enter at your own risk." Julia frowned, tilting her head in curiosity. "Should we check it out?" Marcus studied the cave entrance. "Let's take a look. Just keep your guard up." As they approached, a rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, the sky darkening ominously. Suddenly, rain began to pour down in sheets, drenching them in seconds. "We might not have a choice now," Julia shouted over the storm. "We'll get soaked if we don't go in." Marcus nodded, and they hurried inside, grateful for the shelter. Once inside, they shook off the rain and switched on their headlamps, illuminating the damp stone walls. The air was cool and musty, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. As they ventured deeper, they began to notice strange markings etched into the walls, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a mysterious energy. Julia ran her fingers over the carvings, intrigued. "What do you think these mean?" she wondered aloud. "I'm not sure," Marcus replied, his focus unwavering as he studied the symbols. His calm demeanor was striking against the chaos outside. "But they look old. Someone put a lot of effort into these." Julia glanced at him, noticing how unfazed he appeared by the sudden turn of events. While she felt the weight of the storm outside and the strange atmosphere of the cave pressing in on them, Marcus seemed steady and composed, as if he were accustomed to navigating uncertain situations. "Are you all right?" she asked, sensing the contrast between her own rising anxiety and his coolness. "Just another adventure, right?" he replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His calmness was reassuring, but it made Julia curious. She couldn't help but wonder what lay beneath his surface. What experiences had shaped this man who faced danger with such ease? As they explored the cave further, the storm raged on outside, but inside, they felt an odd sense of safety, despite the mysterious markings surrounding them. As the last echoes of thunder faded and the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, Julia and Marcus made their way toward the cave entrance. They stepped out into the dim light, squinting as their eyes adjusted to the outside world. But what greeted them was not the familiar landscape they had entered. The forest had transformed. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their bark a deep shade of gray, almost lifeless. The vibrant colors of autumn had given way to muted hues, as if a filter of gloom had settled over the area. The path they had followed was no longer visible, replaced by a tangle of roots and stones that seemed to shift beneath their feet. "Is it just me, or does this feel wrong?" Julia asked, unease creeping into her voice. Marcus surveyed their surroundings, his brow furrowing. "It's definitely not what we left." As Marcus looked behind him towards the cave. To his surprise and shock, the cave entrance was gone. All that they could see was a solid stone cliff face. "Yes," Marcus said. "This definitely is not normal." In the distance, they spotted the outline of structures. Faint silhouettes that loomed like shadows against the backdrop of the twisted forest. Driven by curiosity, they made their way toward the figures, only to find themselves facing the entrance to an old village, its architecture ancient and decaying. Julia and Marcus stood at the edge of a dense, ancient forest, their breath catching as they gazed upon the strange and eerie world they had entered. Before them lay a mysterious village nestled against a rugged mountainous landscape, its wooden houses looking as if they had stood the test of countless generations. Each house, adorned with steep, moss-covered roofs, seemed to be carved from the very bones of the earth, their weathered planks and scattered debris hinting at a history long forgotten. In the heart of this village, a larger, more elaborate building dominated the scene. Perched on a higher elevation and shrouded in mist, this central structure with its multiple peaked roofs and intricate wooden architecture, exuded an almost Gothic, fantastical presence. It stood like a sentinel, watching over the village with an air of ancient mystery. The surrounding mountains loomed large and imposing, their jagged peaks piercing the low-hanging dark clouds. The atmosphere was damp and misty, as if the very air was heavy with secrets and untold stories. Shafts of ethereal light broke through the clouds, casting an otherworldly glow on parts of the village and the rugged terrain. Tall, sparse trees dotted the landscape, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The overall scene was one of wild, untamed beauty, a stark contrast to the structured, ordered world Julia and Marcus had left behind. Every element of this new world seemed designed to evoke a sense of intrigue and foreboding, drawing them deeper into its enigmatic embrace. As Julia and Marcus took in this breathtaking view, a mix of awe and unease washed over them. This village, with its haunting beauty and mysterious aura, was their first glimpse into the strange and unknown world they now found themselves in. The journey ahead promised to be as unpredictable and wondrous as the scene before them. "Where do you think we are?" Julia whispered, glancing at Marcus, who seemed deep in thought. "I don't know, but it feels like we've stepped into another time," he replied, his eyes scanning the area. "Stay close to me." As they walked further into the village, a feeling of being watched settled over them, the oppressive silence amplifying their unease. Each turn brought new streets and alleyways that seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the village was expanding around them. "This is weird," Julia said, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "It's like we're in a maze that keeps changing." Marcus nodded, but there was a glint of intrigue in his eyes. "Let's see what we can find." They wandered deeper into the village, passing by dilapidated houses and crumbling walls adorned with peculiar carvings. Strange symbols reminiscent of those they had seen in the cave seemed to repeat here, as if the very essence of the cave had seeped into this place. "Do you think there are people here?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Just as she spoke, they caught sight of movement out of the corner of their eyes. Figures darted between the shadows of the buildings, too quick to be clearly seen. "Did you see that?" Julia exclaimed, gripping Marcus's arm. "Yeah," he said, tension creeping into his voice. "We should keep moving. Whatever this place is, it feels off." As they continued through the winding streets, a low mist began to rise from the ground, wrapping around their ankles and obscuring their view. The village felt alive, as if it were shifting and breathing around them. They had ventured into a realm that defied logic and reason, and the strangeness only seemed to intensify with every step. Finally, they emerged into a clearing, where the massive mansion towered above them, its architecture bizarre and otherworldly. The building appeared both regal and menacing, with tall spires reaching into the overcast sky. Its walls were covered in creeping vines, but the stones themselves seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. The mansion looked out of place, dominating the village like a sentinel watching over its secrets. Glistening gargoyles perched on the edges of the roof, their expressions frozen in time, adding to the unsettling aura surrounding the place. "What do you make of that?" Julia asked, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "I think that's where we need to go," Marcus replied, stepping forward, curiosity piqued despite the lingering dread. "It's at the center of all this, maybe it holds the answers we're looking for." Julia nodded, her heart racing as they approached the mansion, the air thick with anticipation. Whatever lay beyond those doors, they knew they were one step closer to unraveling the mysteries of this strange village. The heavy ornate doors of the mansion creaked as Marcus pushed them open. The moment they crossed the threshold, both Julia and Marcus paused, taken aback. The space inside the mansion was impossibly vast, far larger than it appeared from the outside. The ceiling soared high above, and a grand staircase spiraled upward to multiple floors. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, carrying the scent of aged wood and dust. The architecture was a strange blend of Gothic and modern, with tall archways, dimly lit chandeliers, and walls adorned with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their every move. Shadows flickered and stretched unnaturally as if the dim light was being bent and twisted by an unseen force. Julia couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, and it wasn't just from the paintings. Her background as a criminal psychologist had taught her to trust her instincts, and they were screaming at her now. The mansion had a way of playing with her mind, and the psychological pressure weighed on her more heavily with each passing moment. "This place is something else," she muttered, her voice echoing in the large hall. Marcus remained quiet, scanning the room with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. His mind was racing, processing every detail. While Julia was attuned to the atmosphere and emotions, Marcus's military training took in the surroundings with a different kind of precision. The subtle sound of footsteps on the floor above, the faint draft coming from a slightly ajar door, the way the floorboards creaked in a pattern beneath their feet, it all painted a picture that told him this place wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. They ascended the staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As they reached the second floor, they entered a long corridor lined with doors, each one closed and mysterious. One door, however, stood ajar, casting a sliver of pale light into the hallway. "That's inviting," Julia said dryly, giving Marcus a glance. Marcus nodded, pushing the door open wider. Inside, they found a room that immediately set them on edge. It was as if this place had been waiting for them. The walls were lined with old wooden cabinets and metal lockers, military grade. On a long wooden table in the center of the room lay a selection of equipment that both surprised and unnerved Marcus. There, laid out with precision, were items he hadn't seen since his operational days. "What the?" he whispered, stepping closer. Julia noticed the shift in Marcus's demeanor. This was more than a casual interest. His eyes flicked over the gear with a professional scrutiny, his hand reaching out to touch a set of thermal vision goggles. The specs were high-end, too advanced for civilian use, but exactly the kind of gear a Tier 1 Delta Force operator would use. Thermal goggles, ballistic vests, first aid kits, and backpacks full of Kellogg's, Marcus said under his breath, picking up a small packet of Kellogg's granules. "All this stuff is worth a fortune and not easy to get." Julia moved closer, her eyes scanning the room, feeling out of her element as she watched Marcus's composed assessment of the gear. It was a different side of him. One she had suspected but never seen this close. He continued moving through the items. A rifle leaned up against the wall, magazines, and then something that made him pause. Resting in a custom-fitted case was a Sig Sauer Spectre Comp Blackout 9mm handgun with red dot optics, still brand new. "Marcus?" Julia asked, sensing his hesitation. "This is my favorite sidearm," he said, his voice laced with confusion. "I haven't carried one since I left the military." He picked up the Sig, checking its weight and balance as if it had been made for him. It was unnerving, too precise, too personal. This wasn't just random military gear, it was tailored for him. Julia's brow furrowed. "This can't be a coincidence. This place, it knows you." Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind. The discovery of the Sig, so carefully placed, was a sign that something, or someone, was watching them, aware of who Marcus was, down to his preferences. It was no longer just a creepy mansion. It felt like a trap, a carefully laid one. Julia, her criminal psychologist instincts kicking in, took a deep breath. "This is planned. Everything about this is methodical, intentional. They've put these things here for you, for us. Whoever is behind this knows more than they should." Marcus nodded, his eyes still on the Sig. "Yeah. And that makes this place a whole lot more dangerous." Marcus hadn't spoken much about his past, not to Julia, not to anyone. But standing in that eerie mansion, staring at the gear that seemed tailor-made for him, memories of his life before this strange place began to surface. He had a happy childhood, born into a family that had everything: wealth, love, and stability. His parents doted on him, and there was never a day he felt unsafe or unsure of his place in the world. The family business, a global enterprise, was set to be passed down to him eventually, but at 17, none of that seemed to matter. His world was secure, and he didn't have to think much about the future. But everything changed the year his parents died. Their small private jet went down during a business trip, and in an instant, Marcus's perfect life crumbled. He could still remember the phone call, the way his world shifted as the news hit. The wreckage of the jet was found, but there were no survivors. It was like his whole foundation had been ripped from beneath him. With no parents and no sense of direction, Marcus was adrift. At 18, he wasn't yet old enough to inherit his family's business, so he chose to escape. He heard about the Junior SEALs program, something that promised both an escape and a challenge. It was the Navy's way of preparing future elite soldiers, and Marcus signed up without hesitation. That world suited him. Flying in helicopters, jumping out of airplanes, pushing his body and mind to their limits, it was the exact opposite of the safe, sheltered life he'd known. Soldiering came naturally to him, and the discipline and camaraderie of military life filled a void he didn't know he had. As the years passed, he rose through the ranks, becoming part of an elite Delta Force unit, where he saw and did things most people could never comprehend. But he left that life behind, or at least, he thought he had. As Marcus's thoughts drifted, he and Julia made their way through the strange mansion, exploring its many rooms. They were on edge but didn't let the growing tension overwhelm them. They hadn't been alone long before they heard voices, a man and a woman, coming from just down the hallway. Cautiously, they moved toward the sound, and when they turned the corner, they came face to face with two new hikers. The woman, Amber, was in her late 20s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her clothes were worn from travel, suggesting she'd been wandering for some time. Lucas, a few years older than Amber, had the rugged look of someone used to the outdoors but carried an air of mystery around him. "Who are you?" Julia asked, her voice steady but curious. "We were about to ask the same thing," Lucas replied, his tone wary. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately, sizing them up in a second. He couldn't tell much about them yet, but something told him they weren't ordinary hikers either. Like Julia and him, they seemed more prepared than most for something like this. "We're lost," Amber said bluntly. No idea how we got here. We were hiking, and then... this. Lucas nodded. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. Marcus exchanged a glance with Julia. Their stories seemed matched, and yet something felt off. They hadn't revealed much about themselves, and Marcus knew better than to ask too many questions too soon. Amber and Lucas were an unknown variable, and in a place like this, that could mean anything. Julia studied Amber and Lucas as they stood in the dim hallway of the mansion. They seemed like they could handle themselves, but that didn't mean they weren't a potential risk. Given the strange nature of this place, it was hard to trust anyone. Have you two found any supplies? Julia asked, keeping her tone light but her curiosity sharp. Amber shook her head. No, just locked rooms and creepy hallways. This place is a nightmare. You? Julia nodded slowly. We found some gear. A few things that looked like they were meant for us. It was... strange. Lucas's brow furrowed. Meant for you? What kind of things? Lucas, a renowned trauma surgeon, stands tall and lean, with the quiet intensity of someone who's spent years saving lives under pressure. His sharp, angular features give him a serious look, with piercing blue eyes that seem to be constantly assessing every detail around him. His dark hair is slightly unkempt, with a few strands of gray starting to appear at the temples, hinting at the stress and experience he's endured. His hands are steady and precise, surgeon's hands, capable of incredible delicacy even in the most dire situations. There's a faint scar running along his jawline, adding a rugged edge to his otherwise professional appearance. Though he's calm under pressure, his face often carries a subtle, haunted expression, evidence of the countless lives he's seen hang in the balance. Before Julia could elaborate, Marcus stepped in, his tone casual but with a noticeable undercurrent of authority. Don't worry about it, it's best if you don't go looking for that room. Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly, picking up on the tension in Marcus's voice. What's in there? You hiding something useful? Marcus's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something that told Julia he was taking stock of the situation, preparing for something no one else was quite aware of. She had seen this side of him before in stressful situations, calm, controlled, and unflinching. Just trust me, Marcus said with a half smile. You don't need to be in there. Stick with us, and we'll figure things out. Amber crossed her arms, clearly skeptical, but she didn't press the issue. Amber grew up on her family's ranch in Texas, the kind of place where hard work and resilience were second nature. As a prom queen, she was well-built and effortlessly beautiful, though she never seemed to realize it herself. Her friendly, down-to-earth nature, shaped by the countryside, made her approachable, but her sharp intelligence set her apart. People often underestimated her, mistaking her beauty for lack of substance, but Amber was far more focused and capable than she let on. Her path crossed with Lucas during a chaotic shift in the ER. He was the trauma surgeon, and she was the trauma nurse, both thrown into a high-stakes situation involving a multi-vehicle crash. Amber's quick thinking and calm under pressure caught Lucas's attention. They became an unstoppable team in the operating room, their bond forged in life-or-death moments. While Lucas was quiet and intense, Amber balanced that with her steady, no-nonsense attitude. Over time, they developed a mutual respect, their connection deepened by the unspoken understanding that comes from saving lives together. Despite the tension and chaos around them, Amber remained grounded, unfazed by the pressure, as if her upbringing on the ranch had prepared her for this in some strange way. There was something about Marcus's tone that discouraged argument. Julia knew better than to question Marcus when he spoke like this. She didn't know the full story of his past, only that he'd been in the military. He didn't talk about it much, and she never pried. To her, he was just Marcus, her climbing instructor and the man she had fallen in love with. But moments like this made her wonder just how much more there was to him. Let's keep moving, Marcus added, nodding toward the staircase that led deeper into the mansion. As they walked, Julia's mind kept circling back to what Marcus had said. He didn't want anyone in that room, not because of the supplies, but because of something else. She would have to ask him later, when they were alone, though she doubted he would give her more than a vague answer. Marcus had always kept certain parts of himself locked away, and it was becoming clearer that those parts might be the key to understanding what was happening here. The mansion stretched out before them like a labyrinth, with door after door leading to nowhere. Every room they tried was locked, as if the place itself was picking and choosing what they could see. The halls seemed endless, twisting into shadowy corridors that played tricks on the mind. Despite their best efforts, the mansion kept its secrets hidden. Marcus tried another handle, this one at the far end of the hall. It didn't budge. This place is a maze, he muttered, frustration lacing his voice. Julia frowned. It's like it wants to keep us out of certain areas. Just as they were about to turn back, Amber called from down the hall. Hey, over here, I think we found something. They hurried over to where Amber and Lucas stood, staring at an open door. Inside, the room was fully lit, the warm glow of lamps casting long shadows against the walls. But it wasn't just the light that drew them in. It was the contents of the room. Amber stepped inside cautiously, her eyes darting around. The room was filled with medical supplies, neatly organized on shelves. Boxes of sterile gloves, first aid kits, surgical instruments, and medications lined the walls. Julia's eyes landed on a hospital-grade defibrillator and a set of advanced trauma care equipment. Is this? Julia began, but her voice trailed off as the reality of what they were seeing sank in. Amber moved toward the supplies, her face a mix of disbelief and recognition. This is for me, she whispered, touching the edge of a sterile field kit. Everything I'd need. It's all here. Lucas's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the more advanced surgical tools, the kind only someone with his expertise would know how to use. Whoever put this here knew exactly who we are, he said, his voice tight. This setup, it's for us. Julia and Marcus exchanged a glance, the shock and disbelief on Amber and Lucas's faces all too familiar. They had gone through the same emotions not long ago when they stumbled upon their own gear, tailored to their needs in a way that was impossible to explain. It was unsettling. How could a place like this know so much about them? About what they needed? Someone's been watching, Marcus muttered under his breath, his gaze hardening as he surveyed the room. Amber turned toward them, her voice trembling with uncertainty. How is this possible? We've been lost for hours, and now, this? It doesn't make any sense. It didn't make sense to us either, Julia replied, her voice steady. But we found a room just like this. Different gear, but just as specific. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, clearly rattled. This can't be a coincidence. Someone, or something, put all of this here. It's like we're being prepared for something. Julia nodded slowly. It feels like a setup. Like we've been placed here for a reason. Marcus said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw told Julia he was thinking the same thing. He had a way of reading the situation, analyzing every detail, but he was keeping his thoughts to himself for now. Whatever was happening here, it was far from ordinary, and Marcus was already in soldier mode, quietly calculating their next move. As Amber and Lucas marveled at the room prepared for them, Marcus and Julia pressed on. The hallway grew darker, the air heavier, and the quiet unsettling. When they came across another door, slightly ajar, they instinctively moved toward it. The room inside was dim, with only a sliver of light filtering through thick, tattered curtains. The smell hit them first, a nauseating mix of stale sweat, spoiled food, and something metallic, like blood. Julia's stomach churned. Her eyes roamed over the mess, wrappers, half-eaten meals, empty takeout containers, and piles of dirty clothes haphazardly thrown across the furniture. It was clear someone had been living there for weeks, maybe longer. Julia stepped carefully, avoiding the worst of the debris. On a small table next to the unmade bed, bottles of medication lay scattered and knocked over, their contents spilled. She crouched, picking one up and frowning as she read the label. Antipsychotics, she muttered under her breath. Her fingers brushed across more bottles. SSRIs, strong antidepressants. She didn't need her criminal psychologist training to understand what this cocktail of medication meant. Whoever had been living here wasn't just messy. They were volatile. Her pulse quickened as she stood, putting the bottle back on the table. She could feel the weight of something dark hanging over the room. From outside the door, a voice suddenly echoed down the hall, raspy and edged with paranoia. Hey, what the hell are you doing in there? Marcus stiffened, immediately alert, and moved toward the doorway. Julia froze, her hand still on the bottle, her heart racing. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the dim hallway. He was gaunt, with dark circles under bloodshot eyes, his clothes disheveled and too large for his wiry frame. His hands shook slightly, his jaw clenched like he was holding something back. His eyes darted around the room, frantic and suspicious. You shouldn't be in here, Mike muttered, his voice hoarse, edged with a manic energy. You don't know what you're messing with. Marcus didn't move, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, assessing. Julia, holding the empty bottle, tried to calm her breathing. She recognized the signs instantly: withdrawal, paranoia, the erratic behavior. Mike was unstable, and the last thing they needed was to push him over the edge. We don't want any trouble, Julia said softly, her voice steady. She put the bottle down carefully, keeping her movements slow. We're just passing through. Trouble? Mike's laugh was hollow, almost hysterical. He took a shaky step into the room, his eyes wild. Trouble's already here. This place, it messes with you. It gets inside your head, man. You think you're safe? You're not. None of us are. Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm and controlled. Mike, we're not here to hurt you. We're just trying to figure out what's going on, same as you. But Mike wasn't listening. He stumbled toward the bed, knocking over the table as he clutched his head with both hands. It's already too late. You don't get it. You're trapped, man. Just like me. This place, it's in your mind now. Julia exchanged a glance with Marcus. Mike was spiraling, and there was more to this than just drug withdrawal. The four of them gathered in the rooms they had found, the silence heavy as they processed the bizarre reality of their situation. Julia glanced around, still on edge from their encounter with Mike. Amber and Lucas sat together, talking in low voices, while Marcus busied himself with the equipment they had discovered. His mind was racing, not with panic, but with something close to excitement. Marcus had found more than just a few radios in his room. He handed one to Lucas with a nod, keeping his eyes on Mike, who was still jittering near the doorway. He made the deliberate choice not to give Mike one. No way did he want that guy listening in on their conversations. Too unpredictable. He sorted through more gear, mentally cataloging each item with precision. A collection of AR-15s, sleek and modified beyond anything he'd seen during his time in the field, caught his eye. Next to them, there was a pile of sidearms, including a few more pistols that Marcus made a mental note to keep quiet about. The Sig Sauer 9mm with the red dot optics rested comfortably in his holster. It had become second nature to him again. But the real surprise came when he spotted drone kits, military grade, complete with high-resolution cameras and thermal imaging. He inspected one closely, the thought of testing it from the mansion's roof flashing through his mind. He had always been a hands-on guy, and even though he hadn't flown drones in combat, he could recognize just how advanced this one was. Then he saw something that made his heart beat faster. Sniper rifle setups he had only ever read about. They were brand new, cutting-edge, Barrett, Mk22 MRAD, .338 Norma Magnum with a nice Schmidt and Bender scope, model that hadn't been standard issue when he was still in the unit. The long-range precision, the advanced optics, and the sleek design filled him with a sense of eagerness he hadn't felt in a long time. He allowed himself a rare moment of excitement. It was like a kid being handed a new toy. As he glanced over the arsenal, he couldn't help but think how strange it all was. The gear was perfect, more than perfect. It was exactly what he would need in a situation like this, down to the smallest details. A flicker of something else crossed his mind. Who, or what, wanted him to have this? He brushed the thought aside for now. Just as he was about to inspect another rifle, a sudden, thunderous noise erupted from somewhere near the front of the mansion. The ground beneath them shook, sending a jolt through the walls. Julia flinched, her eyes widening as her body stiffened in reaction to the sound. "What was that?" Julia whispered, her voice shaky. Marcus didn't hesitate. The years of training kicked in like muscle memory. He sprang to his feet, grabbing the SIG and checking it out of habit before heading toward the door, his movements calm and methodical. "Stay here," he said to Julia, his voice steady but firm. "I'll check it out." Julia grabbed his arm, stopping him for a moment. Her eyes, though concerned, showed that same determination Marcus admired in her. "Be careful," she said, her voice soft but laced with urgency. Amber and Lucas exchanged nervous glances, while Mike twitched in the corner, his paranoia feeding off the sudden chaos. Marcus moved through the dim hallway with precision, his steps silent but purposeful. Every muscle in his body was ready for whatever he might find. The mansion felt more oppressive than ever, the walls seeming to close in as he approached the front of the building. The noise had been massive, like something heavy crashing or tearing through the structure, and now there was an eerie silence that followed it. Marcus crept through the hallway, his senses heightened, each footstep light as he made his way toward the front of the mansion. The air felt thicker, heavy with anticipation, but then it hit him. A scream so chilling it stopped him in his tracks. The sound sliced through the air, primal and filled with agony. It wasn't just a scream, it was a cry for help, the kind that came from someone in the throes of something unspeakably painful. A part of him, the soldier, wanted to charge in and neutralize the threat, but Marcus knew better. Rushing in blind had never been his style. He slowed his breathing, letting the sound guide him toward the source. The scream came again, more desperate, more broken. It rattled through his bones. He knew death when he heard it, and this was the kind of death that didn't come quietly. Reaching the front door, Marcus paused for just a second, steadying his nerves. Even though he had seen more than most people could ever imagine, something about this felt off. Different. With practiced precision, Marcus swung open the door, stepping out with his Sig Sauer ready, sweeping the area in front of him.
Shadows stretch, the air is thin. A heavy weight, the fight begins. Stone doors creak, a world unknown. The beast is waiting, flesh and bone. Step through the dark, no turning back. The hunter's gaze, the sky turns black. Pulse is pounding, the die is cast. The moment's here, it moves so fast. Hold the line, stand and fight. In the heart of the endless night, face the fear, steel and flame. Write the story, stake your claim. Courtyard calls, the whispers grow. The blood runs cold, the shadows show. Through clenched teeth, the battle's near. Every breath fuels the fire of fear. Step through the dark, no turning back. The hunter's gaze, the sky turns black. Pulse is pounding, the die is cast. The moment's here, it moves so fast. Hold the line, stand and fight. In the heart of the endless night, face the fear, steel and flame. Write the story, stake your claim. The ground shakes, the walls cry, a reckoning beneath the sky. Through the fire, through the pain, rise above or lose the game. One step closer, one last breath. The hunter walks the line of death. In the silence, the beast will know. A shadow stands, the daylight shows. Hold the line, stand and fight. In the heart of the endless night, face the fear, steel and flame. Write the story, stake your claim. Shakes, the walls cry, a reckoning beneath the sky. Through the fire, through the pain, rise above or lose the game. One step closer, one last breath. The hunter walks the line of death. In the silence, the beast will know. Shadow stands, the daylight shows.